Good evening, and welcome to Live at 5 today on a Friday, because on Wednesday I was supposed to be in Wales visiting colleges for sixth form, but the snow meant that we didn't make it this week, so we could have done it on Wednesday, but actually I was poorly. So this works brilliantly. So our Live at 5 question today is a really, really amazing one. Thank you so much for sending this in. And it went along the lines of, you're always talking about physiological birth in your videos. What is a physiological birth? What a great question. So many of us, when we are used to using particular language, we forget that not everybody has the same language or same terminology or vocabulary. So I do apologise for that. So yeah, what is physiological birth? So language changes and evolves over time. So for some of you, you might be more familiar with the idea of natural birth or straightforward birth. In some aspects, it could be considered normal birth, but a lot of these labels are actually seen as not particularly helpful, because then if you've got a normal birth, can you have abnormal birth? And, you know, what is a natural birth? So when I'm talking, I tend to use the phrase physiological birth because I'm then talking about birth as nature intended. So when everything is going in a straightforward manner, that's what I mean by physiological birth. So this gives me a wonderful opportunity to describe and explain what physiological birth is. And the reason I get so excited about this is that it's my favourite bit. It's biology. You can't argue with it. It's muscles, it's hormones, it's what our body is actually doing during labour and birth. And so I love this bit. There's no sort of wishy-washiness, there's no sort of theories around it. It's simply, this is what's happening in your body during labour and birth. Now, I always talk about this bit when I'm doing taster sessions. If I go into schools and talk about hypnobirthing, I always include this bit, the physiology of birth, because, like I say, it is the nuts and bolts of what our bodies are trying to do during labour and birth. And I think that if everybody understood what our bodies are doing in straightforward labour and birth, actually a lot of the fear that we have wouldn't be there, because we'd understand what our bodies are trying to do. So before we start looking at the muscles involved in our uterus and in labour and birth, I want to rewind a little bit. In essence, we are all mammals, and all mammals have particular needs during labour and birth. And two of those things are that we want to feel safe and unobserved during labour and birth. And that's the same whether we're a mouse or an elephant or anything in between. We all want to feel safe and unobserved. We see it with pets. So if any of you have got cats and you know that your cat's going to have kittens, often what we do is we make a nice little place for them to give birth. We get a box or a basket, and we get maybe a cushion or a little blanket or something, and then we put it somewhere where we think that it would be nice to give birth. But they don't give birth there, do they? No, they give birth down the back of the sofa, or in the back of the wardrobe, or underneath your bed, where they feel safe and unobserved. We also see the same in livestock. So, for instance, sheep. If we have a harsh winter, you bring them down from the hills and you bring them into lambing sheds. Now, you know the ewe that's about to give birth because she's tucked away in the furthest corner away from you. And if you happen to go and have a tea break or a wee break, there's a birth explosion while you're gone. They want to feel safe and unobserved. We also see it in wild animals as well. So if you've got a deer, for instance, they tend to come away from the herd and they hunker down in the grass and they give birth there. But really, really interestingly, if a predator comes on the scene at that point in time, that's not a good time to be giving birth. That's a great little snack for that predator if mum gives birth at that point in time. And so we see something incredible. That mum is not going to give birth in that situation. Labour can slow down, and in some cases it can rewind as well. It's completely stop until that threat has passed. It's an evolutionary safety mechanism. It means that we're not going to give birth when there's a predator around. Fantastic. Now, I'm sure that some of you have heard stories of women who are birthing maybe at home and things are going along smoothly. They then go to a hospital and often things slow down at that point in time. We have that evolutionary safety mechanism as well. If we don't feel perfectly safe, perfectly unobserved, our labours can slow down as well. So with that in mind, we can think a little bit about muscles. Now, in our bodies, our muscles tend to work in pairs. So for instance, we've got our bicep and our tricep here. When one works, when one engages, my bicep is engaging here to move my arm this way, this one releases. And then to move my arm the other way, this one is going to engage, shorten, and this one is going to relax. And that moves my arm the other way. Beautiful mechanism. And when I'm using my arm, I don't expect those muscles to hurt. And my uterus is the same. I have a pair of muscles. So if you imagine that your uterus is like a sack, like a sack of muscles. The first layer of muscles is an inner layer and they circle round the uterus. So if you can imagine my fingers there are the round muscles. They circle around the uterus all the way round, all the way up to the top. So, you know, different bands of muscles. Now, during pregnancy, most of those muscles are concentrated towards the lower end of the uterus. And what they do is they hold everything nice and tightly. So down here is my cervix. And those muscles keep everything nice and tightly together. The muscles of our cervix are nicely, tightly clenched, keeping our mucus plug in place. We'll talk about that another day. But those round muscles are concentrated towards the lower end of the uterus, keeping that cervix nice and tightly shut, keeping everything in that needs to be in, keeping everything out that should be out. Now, that needs to be really, really strong because if you consider the weight of the baby, the amniotic fluid, the fact that we go and do Zumba during our pregnancies, you know, it's got to be really, really strong muscles. So those round muscles are nice and tight there with that big chunky muscle underneath. Now, the second layer of muscles, they are outer layer of muscles and they are sort of finger-like projections that run the length of the uterus. Now, the first thing that happens when we go into labour is that those round muscles relax. So rather than being like a clenched fist, they relax. And that's the first thing that happens. And that can happen a couple of days, even a week before our actual labour feels like anything's starting. And that's where sometimes our mucus plug, again, language, comes away and we then have our bloody show. Again, lovely language. We'll talk about that another time. But that can happen and sometimes we notice that mucus coming away and that can be a sign that our labour is imminent. But it can take another couple of days before anything happens. Now, when our contractions start, or as we call them in hypnobirthing, our surges, what's happening then is that those long muscles are drawing upwards. And that's it. They draw upwards. And each time they draw upwards, they are moving those round, relaxed muscles. So again, you know, like we had our bicep and our tricep here. When they're working, these ones are shortening. So that's like the long muscles. These ones are relaxed, so they move. And the same goes with our uterus. So those round muscles now are nice and relaxed. And those long muscles are drawing upwards. I'm just going to stand up to give you an idea. So each time we have a surge, those muscles are drawing upwards. And what you can see there is the cervix then starts shortening and starts opening. And you can see that those round muscles then are starting to bunch up behind the baby. So this is all happening in our first part of labour. Sometimes we call it stages, the first stage of labour. The stages of labour are a human construct, just to make everything nice and neat. It doesn't really fit into that. But for purposes of this, it makes it more sort of easy to understand. But in that first part of labour, those long muscles are drawing upwards to give our baby enough space to move out. And then when our baby has got enough room to move out, those muscles are now bunched up behind the baby. And these start working almost like a piston, moving the baby down. And this is our second stage of labour, that sort of characteristic pushing stage. And those muscles then are pushing down behind the baby so that baby can be born. Yay! My children have nicked my baby dolls, so I've ended up using a teddy bear for the last little while. But you get the idea. You've got a pair of muscles, you've got that long muscles moving, those round muscles out of the way so that baby's got enough space, and then those muscles pushing down behind the baby to move the baby down and out. And that's it. That's what's happening in labour and birth. Woohoo! Now, usually when I explain this to people, they go, that's fascinating and wonderful. But that doesn't sound like the birth I've seen on telly or the birth I've heard about, because if it's that simple, why does it hurt so much? Okay, so for that, we need to understand our central nervous system. And we've got two settings that are important in birth. And one of those is called our fight or flight system. Now, many of you may have already heard of the fight or flight system. It is another evolutionary safety mechanism. It's a great system. It's helped us survive as a species. So, for instance, in the days where we were hunter-gatherers, we'd be out hunting, gathering, saber-toothed tiger. In the instant that we see that threat, we freeze. And as we freeze, our body releases a hormone called adrenaline. And that adrenaline makes our heart pump faster, makes our lungs take in more oxygen, and it diverts the blood and the oxygen in our body to our extremities, to our arms and our legs, so that we can run away from that threat, or if we need to, fight it. Great if we've got a saber-toothed tiger. Not so great if we're in labour. Because when our fight-flight system is engaged, everything that is not needed for fighting or flighting is actually put on a back burner. Our uterus is not needed for fighting or flighting, running away. Therefore, the blood and the oxygen are diverted away from those uterine muscles. So now, if we've got that adrenaline in the mix, those long muscles still trying to do their things. But rather than those round muscles now being relaxed, they're clamped down. They're going, nope, not safe. Not safe to give birth right now. So we've got conflict between those muscles. The long muscles are still trying to do their thing, but the round muscles don't want to move. That is not going to be comfortable. On top of that, those long muscles are now trying to work with reduced blood flow and oxygen. And any of you who've been to the gym or done any sports knows that if we have muscles working without oxygen going to them, it builds up something called lactic acid. And lactic acid means that we get cramp. Yeah, so now we've got a labour that's not progressing because those round muscles don't want to go anywhere, and now is painful because that lactic acid that is built up in those muscles, those long muscles, as they're trying to do their thing. Yeah, now this is what a lot of people do experience during labour and birth. Our fight or flight system has been engaged, that adrenaline is in our body, and it diverts that blood and the oxygen away from the muscles that are trying to work to get your baby out. Now, on the flip side, we've got another system, which is called the parasympathetic nervous system. So we've got our fight or flight, which is also known as our sympathetic nervous system, and then we've got our parasympathetic nervous system. Now, this has got all sorts of lovely names. It's called things like rest and digest, breed and feed, all sorts of different things. But the basic idea is this is the system that most of us are in most of the time, where our body's just getting on with things. It's the system of calm, it's the system of equilibrium, it's the system of balance, which is great just generally. But if we're in labour and our parasympathetic nervous system is in control, we release a cocktail of hormones to make sure that labour moves swiftly and comfortably. Now, in that cocktail of hormones, it's a whole bunch of different hormones, but the one that we want to focus on right now is one called oxytocin. Now, you've probably heard me talk about oxytocin lots because I love oxytocin. It was so amazing that I had a tattoo of oxytocin. I love oxytocin. It is the hormone of love. It is the hormone that we produce when we fall in love. When we think about the other person and we get that little whoof, that is oxytocin. When we make love, we release loads of oxytocin. When we orgasm, we release loads of oxytocin. And during labour, we release loads and loads of oxytocin. And what happens with that oxytocin that is released into our blood is it's taken up by those uterine muscles. And it means that every surge, every contraction is more effective, more efficient, so our labour progresses smoother and swifter. If that wasn't good enough, we also release oxytocin in the brain as a neurotransmitter. And what that does is it activates the reward centres of our brain, the pleasure zones in our brain, and it stimulates the release of beta endorphins. Now, some of you will know about beta endorphins. They are our body's own painkiller. And we release those during labour if that oxytocin is being released into our body. So nature's already got it sussed. It's got everything there to ensure that labour is swift and comfortable and, dare I say, enjoyable in some cases as well. So this whole system is there for us. But we don't tend to hear of many women having swift, comfortable, enjoyable births. So why is it that we seem to struggle as humans? Why do we have an issue? No other animal seems to have so much of an issue with giving birth. We don't see cats demanding gas and air. We don't see sheep wanting epidurals. I did get challenged about this a little while ago and they said, well, they can't talk. Well, yes, they can't talk. But if you've ever been with a cat who's giving birth, she doesn't look like she's writhing around in agony. Her pupils are dilated. She's doing that pooching thing. She's purring. She doesn't look like she's writhing around in agony. So why are we so different from all the other mammals? This, our neocortex, the newest thinking, analysing part of our brains. Michel Ledont, I know I go on about him a lot. Michel Ledont says that it's the biggest inhibitor to straightforward birth. We can create a fight or flight system just by imagining it. And we all do this. How do you feel the day before an exam or an interview or an audition? Our heart's going like the clappers. Our breathing might be a bit erratic. All of these things are signs that we've triggered our fight or flight. We've released that adrenaline. We cannot produce adrenaline and oxytocin at the same time. So as soon as we got adrenaline in the mix, our oxytocin system is not happening. And if most of us are worried or scared or nervous about birth, that's enough to trigger that adrenaline and interrupt that oxytocin process. And that is why many of us struggle to have straightforward, calm, swift, comfortable, enjoyable births, because our fight or flight system has been triggered. Now, there are other things that trigger the adrenaline as well, and those things we go through in much more detail when we do a full course. But that gives you the bare bones of our physiology of birth. And when I'm talking about physiological birth, that is what I'm talking about. That hormone cycle being able, that the cocktail of hormones being able to be released so that labour can move swiftly, comfortably, enjoyably. So when I'm talking about physiological birth, that is what I'm referring to. Now, there is more to it than that. Obviously, that is a very sort of brief whistle-stop tour. But that gives you an idea of what's happening in our muscles, what happens with the hormones, and how the environment can have an effect on those things. And so that is a little bit about the physiological birth. The physiology of birth. Oh, hi, Sarah. Yes, I know that you love oxytocin too. We are oxytocin junkies here. So, yay. It's lovely to see you. Thank you very much for joining me. If you would like to know more about the physiology of birth, the biology that's involved in labour and birth, and after giving birth as well, that's exactly the sort of thing that we cover in the full Hypnobirthing course. We've got plenty of courses coming up, so I've got them every month. I've got virtual courses, which we do via Zoom. I've got in-person courses. I do group courses, and I do one-to-ones as well. So find a course, have a look at my website, or you can follow my bio if you're in Instagram. You can find out when courses are coming up. But if you've got more questions, drop me a line. Let me know what you would like me to answer this time. Well, no, it won't be this time next week. On Wednesday next week. It'll be back to normal time next week. I look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you for joining me. Bye.